Everyone in my social circle knew that I've been craving Willow's body since childhood. As her loyal simp, I've always been the first to cater to her every whim. She likes black, so I bought her black stockings. She likes foreign languages, so I bought her French polka dot socks. She likes flower arranging, so I bought her little floral leg warmers. I served her with all my heart. Yet on our wedding day, she ran off. She fled abroad to save her struggling crush, a childhood friend of 20 years. Becoming the biggest joke of all, I stood there in my expensive suit, with dozens of stockings in my bag, carrying the burden alone. And still, I completed the grand wedding by myself while everyone was waiting to see me humiliated. I was the one laughing the loudest. What a foolish woman. Women are everywhere. I'd just find another and start putting stockings on her legs again. But a business empire? That's one of a kind. I didn't just crave her body, I also craved her money. Chapter 1. Willow's plane had already taken off. I locked myself in the lounge and squeezed out a tear. My furious father was shouting outside the lounge, while Mr. Liu was angrily dialing one call after another. Vowing to catch Willow the moment she landed, there were 2 new messages on my phone. Willow had written, "George, wait for me to return. I'll explain everything to you." The other message was a picture of Willow. She was walking towards the boarding gate, anxiously talking on the phone. The fishtail dress she was wearing was the wedding gown I'd worked on with the designer, perfecting every little detail. The jewelry I had carefully selected was hanging loosely from her hair, her eyes soft, filled with affection, as if she were sweetly flirting with the person on the other end of the phone. Anyone who saw her would think, the man loved by her is truly lucky. I zoomed in on the picture, staring at it for a long time. It was hard to let go, but I gave her the chance, and she made her choice. I had to stand by my decision without regrets. I washed my face, adjusted my suit, and confidently stepped out of the lounge, smiling as I greeted the relatives, whose expressions varied. I said, "The wedding will continue as planned." Chapter 2. Willow returned to the country 3 days later. In those 72 hours, I became the undisputed trending topic. Domestic media outlets, from big newspapers to social media, all discussed the story of George Wang, the eldest son of the Wang family, who was abandoned by his bride on their wedding day yet still went through all the wedding procedures alone. Some expressed sympathy for me. Some criticized the coldness of wealthy families, while others seemed to delight in my misfortune. No matter what, the endless news coverage had my name, for the first time, in the spotlight. Even before Willow's, to apologize to the Wang family. My father-in-law, Chairman Liu, personally hosted a banquet to make amends. As glasses clinked and the atmosphere settled, Chairman Liu raised his glass to me, saying, "George, this drink is for you, son. You truly live up to being old Wang's son. Thank you for making the hard decision and considering the bigger picture, protecting both our families' reputations. The Liu family owes you. And don't worry, I will make sure to give you an explanation for this matter." I humbly raised my glass, about to speak, when the doors to the banquet hall were pushed open and Willow, looking exhausted, walked in. My father darkened at the sight of her, slamming his drink down from the air. The massive banquet hall fell silent. Chairman Liu glared at my father, gritted his teeth, and then barked at Willow, "Kneel." Willow slowly walked up to my father and slightly lowered her head. She spoke softly, "Dad, this time, I was wrong." My father snorted, but said nothing in reply. However, the next moment, Willow placed a document on the table. She raised her chin and said proudly, "But I've also brought the contract back. During my trip to the US as the wife of the Wang family, I represented the Wang family and signed the deal with Eagle Group." Chapter 3. The deal with Eagle Group had been something the Wang family had been working on for half a year. All the details were finalized. Yet Eagle Group had been dragging its feet and refused to sign. The Wang family had tried everything, but no breakthrough could be found. My father had been stressed about this deal for so long that his hair was turning gray. I have to admit, Willow knew exactly how to play the game. This contract, if signed, would be a huge credit to the Wang family. My father was left speechless, unable to respond to Willow's bold statement. Willow stood there, head lowered, her posture graceful, and her expression composed. Chairman Liu finally relaxed and clapped his hands, leading the applause. "Well, old Wang, what do you think?" My daughter did a great job, didn't she? She helped you secure the Eagle deal. That's something worth rewarding. After the awkward silence, others at the table joined in the applause, the mood gradually warming. But Willow, who had caused so much humiliation to the Wong family, truly thought everything could be forgiven so easily. Frowning, I walked up to her. Sizing her up from head to toe, I said, "Willow, why are you still wearing the dress from our wedding day? Is it because taking care of Mr. Ito was so tiring that you didn't have time to change? Or is the wedding dress just more convenient for you to look after him?" The room went silent. Willow's smile froze on her face. I forced a smile and walked toward her, putting my arm around her shoulder to guide her out, saying, all right, why don't you go take a shower, change into some fresh clothes, and rest for a bit? Don't worry, I've got this covered. Behind us." A loud thud echoed as someone slammed their hand on the table. I didn't have to turn around to know it was my father. Chairman Wong's voice rang out, teeth gritted. "Stop, you're not going anywhere." At that moment, a thin figure rushed in through the door and blocked the space between Willow and me. He spoke. "Don't make things difficult for Miss Willow. It's my fault, all my fault." Chapter 4. The person who had just entered was none other than the one who had caused Willow to flee on her wedding day. Her crush, Makoto. Makoto bowed shakily to apologize, but stumbled and almost fell to the floor. In full view of everyone, Willow quickly rushed to his side, clinging to his arm to steady him. She said with a look of concern, "Didn't I tell you to wait in the car? Why did you come up here? Are you feeling unwell?" Makoto's face was pale, his expression pained. Yet there was also a certain resigned look in his eyes as he held Willow's shoulder and said, "Willow, don't argue with Chairman Liu over me. It's not worth it. I don't have much time left. I can't leave you with a mess." Before he could finish, Makoto broke into a violent coughing fit. Willow furrowed her brow and without saying a word, began to help him out of the room. Ignoring everyone else in the hall, she said, "Makoto, don't worry, I'll take you to the hospital." But the next moment, Chairman Liu's voice rang out sharply, "Willow, stop." Liu Chairman's fury was palpable as he shouted, "If you walk out that door, you have nothing to do with the Liu family anymore." Willow halted, turned around, and coldly glared at Chairman Liu. She bit her lip and said, "The thing I regret the most is not stopping you from sending Makoto abroad all those years ago. You think you can still control me like you did back then." Chairman Liu's face turned ashen. But he was left speechless. My father shook his head and said, "Old Lee, it seems you're no longer in control of the Liu family." Willow glanced at my father and rolled her eyes. "Mr. Wong, I didn't go straight to the hospital with Makoto because I came to find you and George. Isn't that enough? Some things are better left unsaid and buried deep inside." She turned to me, her eyes icy. "George, I promised to marry you. And I did. I am Mrs. Wong now. You might be pleased with that. But when it comes to feelings, don't expect me to feel the same. You'll never make me love you." With that, she helped Makoto out of the room, not even bothering to look back. Makoto, holding her shoulder, turned and glanced at me. He barely lifted the corner of his mouth in the faintest of smiles. Chapter 5. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, I angrily crushed the glass in my hand, and blood dripped from my fingers, falling drop by drop onto the cold white tiles. Willow and I were childhood sweethearts, growing up in a world of honeyed affection. I was always her shadow, following her every step. Whatever she liked, I learned to like. I had no hobbies of my own. Willow's hobbies were George's hobbies. The business empires of the Wong and Liu families had been intertwined since our father's generation. Inseparable, always connected in some way. So, it was almost a given that Willow and I would marry, something all the elders had already accepted. The only surprise came in our second year of high school when Makoto received a scholarship and transferred to our class as a poor student. He was like a beacon of light in a storm, warm and strong, easily stirring Willow's admiration for him. But before her feelings could fully bloom, Mr. Liu extinguished them in their cradle. Even though Willow strongly protested, Mr. Liu still sent Makoto abroad. Willow lost all contact with Makoto. After that, she became distant, cold, and silent. When she agreed to our arranged marriage, I once asked her what she would do if Makoto came back. At that time, her eyes shone with starlight, and she looked at me with gentle affection. She said, In all innocence, that was all in the past. I was so young then. I didn't understand what love was. I only wanted to be George's wife. And I can only be George's wife. That day, our kiss, full of passion and promise, seemed to linger in the air for a moment, but in an instant, everything had changed. Chapter 6. Growing up, I had only a few moments where I lost control and showed my anger in front of others. Seeing me like this, I think it hurt them more than if they had killed me. My mom rushed over to help me tend to my wound. But my father, ignoring all propriety, shouted at Mr. Liu, furious, before storming off with me. Of course, I didn't forget to take the contract with Eagle Group. Willow never reached out to me. The news about her and Makoto still came to me through my informants. Makoto had been diagnosed with cancer and didn't have much time left. But he refused to go to the hospital. He obsessively insisted on staying in our wedding house with Willow, this absurd request, and Willow didn't even reject it. Louis, furious, pointed his finger at my nose and shouted, "George, aren't you going to do anything? Aren't you angry?" "You're acting like a damn cuckolded turtle." I laughed. Angry, I paused my work, placed my hand over my chest, and closed my eyes for a moment to feel it. A little sad, but not much. Seeing Louis on the verge of bursting a vein, I patted him on the shoulder and said, "The contract with Eagle has reached its first payment stage. I've got to stay on top of it. Money is 100 times more important than women." My brother, Louis, spat on my face in frustration. He cursed, "Don't give me that, George. You're not lacking money. Your Wong family and the Liu family can shake the whole industry just by stomping their feet." Seeing him nearly pass out from anger, I thought for a moment and decided to reassure him. I said, "Don't worry, this isn't over. Makoto should be coming to find me soon." Chapter 7. As I had expected, when Makoto saw my lack of reaction to his provocation, he couldn't hold back any longer and sought me out, sitting down in a cafe beneath the Wong family building. I carefully studied him and smiled. "Makoto, you're looking well. Looks like my wife's been taking good care of you." Makoto stretched his hand out in front of me. "Mr. Wong, does this look familiar to you?" he continued. "The Liu family's ancestral ring. If I'm not mistaken, it was entrusted to you on the day of your engagement. You've been wrapping it up so carefully and hiding it away in your display case. It's honestly laughable. The thing you treat like a treasure is something I've played with at will. You're just relying on your background to keep Willow to yourself. Outside of that, you have nothing, whereas I, aside from your wealth and status, have everything you don't." You find Makoto's arrogant expression. I couldn't help but find it ridiculous. "Makoto, congratulations on living your dream," I said. "There's a detail you might not have noticed, but I'd like to remind you of it." I paused for a moment before continuing. "Mr. Liu sent you abroad, and for so many years, you tried everything but couldn't get in touch with Willow. Now tell me, who, just before our wedding, leaked the news to you, and why? After 10 years of calling her and never getting through. Is it suddenly so easy to reach her?" Makoto froze. He stared at me, wide-eyed, disbelieving. "No way. Is it you? Are you out of your mind?" I leaned back in my chair, smiling at him, not saying a word. Makoto looked at me for a long while, his expression flickering. He was panicking. "George, what exactly are you after?" I almost burst out laughing. I casually replied, "Makoto, do you really need to ask that? Of course. I'm here to protect my family and keep my beloved wife. I've been chasing Willow for over 20 years. How could I just hand her over to you? You'll have to try harder." Makoto was furious, picking up the coffee cup from the table and ready to throw it at me. I pulled out a document and handed it to him. When Makoto saw the words on the document, his face went pale in an instant. He stuttered. "Why you? How do you have this?" I laughed, put on my coat, and stood up. "Makoto, I won't be letting you go free. Let's see who's better at this." Chapter 8. A few days later, I was invited to the 20th birthday party of David, the youngest son of the Law family. As I entered, I happened to witness David punch Makoto in the face. There was a loud thud, and Makoto's cheek visibly swelled. David was clearly furious, grabbing Makoto by the collar and throwing him to the floor. He was about to move forward when Willow's voice stopped him. "David, why are you hitting him?" David stopped in his tracks, turning to look at Willow, his eyes burning with anger. He adjusted his high-end suit, which had lost a row of buttons, He gritted his teeth and said, "Willow, I invite you to my birthday party, and you bring this piece of trash to ruin it." It was clearly Makoto's doing. David was the youngest son of Mr. Law, with 3 older sisters. He was the son of his parents' old age and had been doted on since childhood. David started acting at the age of 16, and by 20, he had swept all the major awards in the film industry. He was the youngest and hottest movie star, enjoying immense fame. He had never been humiliated like this. Before Willow could speak, Makoto got up from the floor and rushed toward David. He shoved David away and yelled, "Stay away from my woman," acting all cool and trying to get Willow drunk. "We're both men. We all know what you're up to." David, speechless, said, "Are you crazy? I've been offering everyone a drink." Makoto completely ignored him, turning to Willow with a face bruised and swollen from the fight. He said in a tone of sorrow, "Willow, I understand now. I didn't protect you, and I brought trouble to you. I don't come from a prominent family, and I don't have the time to build my own career like Mr. Law. Everything that's happened to me, I deserve it. I understand." Willow, heartbroken, immediately rushed into his arms, comforting him with a helpless, loving expression. "Fool, you'll always be the warmest harbor in my heart." Makoto looked at her with affectionate eyes. "Really, I also want to act like David, win an award, drive a luxury car, and live in a mansion. Willow, would you support me?" Willow immediately made a phone call, arranging for a film company to back Makoto. I watched the farce from a distance, finding it utterly laughable. In the end, people are bound by what they couldn't have in their youth. That once proud swan, now so effortlessly, would be dragged down from her pedestal by Makoto, this toad. Chapter 9. Willow gradually became the laughingstock of the circle. Of course, I, the unfortunate husband, was in the same boat. Makoto had completely taken over her life. At every banquet she attended, at every event she went to, Makoto was always there. After a few of Makoto's outbursts, all the men in the circle wisely kept their distance from Willow. The next time I saw Willow was when the Wong and Liu family signed a major project with the municipal government, and we had to attend the press conference hosted by the government. The older generation had gradually stepped back, leaving Willow and me as the leaders of the group, so we had a responsibility to attend such events. While waiting backstage, I noticed that Willow was alone, which struck me as unusual. I asked, "Mr. Ito didn't come with you today?" Willow looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, there was a shadow in her eyes. She bit her lip and said, "He's on set filming." Several months after she had told me not to expect any affection from her, Willow surprisingly smiled at me. She spoke seriously. "This event is very important, so of course, I should attend with my husband." I stepped back 2 paces, keeping an appropriate distance. "Miss Liu, in such a setting, it would be more appropriate for you to call me Mr. Wong." Willow's smile faltered, and she took a step forward, forcing herself to speak. "George." Just then, the host invited the guests into the venue. I ignored the unreadable emotion in Willow's eyes, nodded at her, and turned to enter the conference hall. The press conference was broadcast live. Once seated, I suddenly remembered something and turned to Willow, who was sitting on my right. "Miss Liu, does Mr. Ito know that we'll be attending this event together?" The host's voice was loud, so Willow tilted her head slightly to hear me better. No sooner had I finished speaking than Willow's phone, which was lying on the table, began to vibrate. The host announced that the conference had officially begun, and the municipal leaders gave their speeches. Willow hesitated for a second before picking up her phone to hang up the call. Chapter 10. The municipal leader's speech lasted for 5 minutes, and Willow's phone had been vibrating non-stop for 5 minutes. I glanced at the screen, seeing Makoto's name flashing, and turned a smile at Willow. "Your relationship is truly enviable," I said. Willow pursed her lips but didn't respond. After the speech, it was time for the winning companies to make their statements, and the live broadcast camera focused on me. I stood up. Having been seated for too long, my legs went numb. I swayed toward Willow's direction. Willow instinctively stood up to support me, her arm wrapped tightly around mine. I looked down at her and smiled. "Thank you, Miss Liu." Willow froze, staring at me until I smiled and withdrew my hand. Before I could finish my speech, a staff member rushed in and whispered something to the host. The host quickly reported to the municipal leader, and after getting approval, The screen was switched on to show live footage, and Koto's figure appeared on the rooftop. He shouted, "Willow, why aren't you answering my calls? Why are you running off to find George? Look at George smiling so happily at you. What did you say to him? Why do you always force me to resort to such extreme measures just to see you?" The camera focused on Willow. She stood up and stared at the screen, replying resolutely, "Makoto, I didn't say anything. I only came here because I had no choice. Don't be impulsive. Please come down." Makoto, in a fit of rage, yelled, "I don't believe it. You're the Liu family's precious young lady. Who else could force you to do something you don't want to do? You just want to see George, don't you?" "You two are married now, and you've been with him all along. You must have missed him and want to see him. Right. You even helped him up. You even let him touch your hand. Do you have no shame?" Willow, in complete distress, pleaded, "Makoto, I didn't. Please come down. I'll come find you now, okay?" Makoto, nearly hysterical, screamed, "No, unless you prove it to me. Yes, go slap George. Go ahead. If you slap him, then I'll believe that you haven't strayed." Willow looked at the municipal leaders beside her, their faces already dark, unwilling to even look at her. Finally, Willow couldn't hold it in anymore. She shouted frantically, "Makoto, stop being crazy." As soon as those words left her lips, Makoto lost all control. He rushed down from the rooftop, jumped into his car, and sped toward the crowd. There were many extras standing by to watch, and they had no time to get out of the way. We could only watch helplessly as people were knocked to the ground on the screen. Makoto didn't stop. He sped away, leaving chaos in his wake. Chapter 11. By the time we arrived at the scene, both the police and ambulances were already there, and the place was in chaos. Injured people were lying all over the ground, with bloodstains everywhere. I immediately made a decision and instructed the staff to open all the RV doors and help the mildly injured people into the RV to rest. While I was busy, I heard Willow's phone ring. Makoto's shrill voice came through the speaker. He wailed, "Willow, help me. The car crashed into a tree. And I'm trapped, I'm bleeding a lot, I want to see you." I turned around to look, and Willow was busy helping the injured, so she had put the phone on speaker. Upon hearing Makoto's words, she immediately stood up, anxiously asking, "Makoto, where are you? I'll come to you right away." As she spoke, she walked toward the exit. I sighed and called out to her, "Willow, after such a big incident, you can't leave. The film company is a subsidiary of the Liu family. If the follow-up arrangements aren't handled properly, it will severely impact the Liu family's image. You must stay to handle the aftermath." Perhaps hearing my voice, Makoto became even more dramatic, continuing to play the victim. "Willow, I might never see you again. I love you. If I die like this, please forget me." Willow hesitated. Her eyes were filled with pain and struggle. After a moment, she bit her lip, pulled my sleeve, and sobbed. "George, please, I'm leaving this to you. Makoto, he's in the final stage of cancer. He won't live much longer. I'll make it up to you. I promise." Before I could respond, Willow turned and was about to leave. I smiled and said, "Willow, by the way, do you know what my nickname is? It's Autumn. Do you know what it means?" Her footsteps faltered for a moment. Maybe she heard me, or maybe she didn't. But she didn't turn back and just continued walking. I sighed and muttered to myself, "Autumn, when the crops start to ripen. The season of harvest is near." Chapter 12. This was a mass incident, and the impact was devastating. Willow's last-minute escape was captured by a passerby and posted online, further worsening the already precarious public image of the Liu family. I worked non-stop for 48 hours, tirelessly taking charge as Willow's husband, the spokesperson for the Wang and Liu families, managing the situation, comforting the injured, and coming up with practical compensation plans. When I had finally handled everything, exhausted, I walked out of the Liu building and was startled by the figure standing at the entrance. It was Willow. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face streaked with tears, and she looked completely shattered. She choked out, "George." Her voice was so hoarse that I could hardly make out what she was saying. She continued, "George, Makoto has been arrested. My father, he was so enraged that he had a heart attack, and he's still in the ICU." I looked up at the sky. The first light of dawn was starting to break, and a streak of morning sunlight was about to pierce the darkness. As if not noticing Willow's misery, I smiled at her and said something without context. "Willow, look, the The sky is getting brighter. Chapter 13. Chairman Liu finally regained consciousness, and Willow and I rushed to the hospital. When Chairman Liu woke up, half of his hair had turned white. Upon seeing Willow, he closed his eyes in disappointment and turned his head away. Mrs. Liu's eyes were swollen from crying. She stood up, grabbed my hand, and tears started to fall once again. Before Willow could say anything, her phone rang. She hesitated for a moment and then switched it to speakerphone. A voice on the other end said, "Hello, is this Ms. Willow? Mr. Makoto is in our detention center and insists on seeing you." After we refused his request according to the rules, he bit his own tongue and attempted suicide. We discovered it in time, and Mr. Ito only sustained minor injuries. Before the person on the other end could finish speaking, Willow had already turned and was running toward the door. Mrs. Liu shouted, "Willow, come back here," Mrs. Liu cried out loudly. Willow hesitated for a moment, but then opened the door and walked out without looking back. Chairman Liu painfully closed his eyes, and a single tear slipped down the corner of his eye. I stood beside him, and the atmosphere became extremely awkward just as I was debating whether to leave. Chairman Li's assistant, Chan, came rushing in out of breath. He said, "Chairman, something's wrong." I instinctively grabbed him and asked, "Assistant Chan, what's going on? Take your time." Chan, still catching his breath, looked at the chairman, who looked like a lifeless corpse on the bed, and fell silent. Chairman Liu waved his hand weakly. "It's fine. Go ahead and speak," Chan cautiously said. "We just received a notice from the city government. They are extremely dissatisfied with Willow's behavior in this incident. They've requested Liu family withdraw from the project or reconsider after replacing the general manager." Mrs. Liu suddenly jumped up. Panic-stricken, Chairman Liu, lying on the hospital bed, was breathing heavily. The blood pressure monitor beside the bed started to beep wildly. I quickly pressed the service button next to the bed. Before the nurse could arrive, Chairman Liu struggled for breath and passed out. Chapter 14. Chairman Liu had a stroke, but thanks to timely treatment, his life was saved. Half of his body was paralyzed, and he would now spend the rest of his life in a hospital bed. When Willow received the news and rushed back, she was met with a decision to replace the general manager of the company. The person taking over was me. She stood outside Chairman Liu's hospital room for several days, but Chairman Liu refused to see her. One late night, after handling my work and feeling extremely exhausted, I decided to spend the night in my office. Just as I turned off the lights, my phone began buzzing incessantly. It was Willow. After hesitating for a moment, I answered the call. I said, "Willow." The receiver was silent, so I called out again, "Willow." She must have been crying, as her voice was tinged with a misty sadness in the quiet of the night. She choked up and said, "George, I've returned the signet ring and put it back in its original place. It's been so many days. Why haven't you come to take it back?" I hesitated, carefully choosing my words. "Willow, you know that since I was little, I've never used anything that belonged to someone else." There was a long silence before I heard her laugh bitterly. Her tone was full of sorrow as she asked, "Does that include people too?" I didn't know how to respond, so I simply hummed in acknowledgement. As the night grew deeper, perhaps because I hadn't hung up the phone, her desire to speak was finally released. Willow alternated between laughter and crying over the phone. She said, "George, Makoto lied to me. He didn't have cancer. He only used cancer to gain my sympathy. No wonder he refused to go to the hospital and insisted on staying at home. When he had his checkup in the detention center, I found out that he wasn't sick at all. Not at all." She cried uncontrollably as she became more agitated. "George, I regret it so much. I hated my father for more than 10 years because of someone like him. I missed our wedding because of him. And I hurt your heart. George, after everything, I finally realized that the only person in this world who has always been good to me is you. Only you." Willow kept speaking, and I just quietly listened. The gentle night breeze blew through the window. And in that daze, I found myself thinking back to that year. Makoto had been sent abroad by Mr. Liu, and Willow had taken out her anger on me, often drinking and throwing tantrums, but I worried about her. Every time she and her friends drank too much and wandered off, I would go find her and take her home. That night, the breeze was gentle, just like tonight. I stood at the door of a private room, hearing her friend say, "Willow, George is searching everywhere for you every day. It must be quite pathetic. If it's really not working, just tell him clearly. Don't keep him hanging. Let him give up." The breeze was so gentle, and Willow said something. She said, "If it weren't for marrying George, Makoto wouldn't have been treated so unfairly. Makoto is suffering alone abroad. So why does George get to live so comfortably? I'm not just going to marry him. I want to swallow up the Wang family and make him the world's biggest joke." I snapped back from my memory. Willow had fallen silent, probably asleep. I could hear her breath. Soft and teary, I smiled gently. "Willow, George won't wait for you forever. George has already moved on." Well, Chapter 15. It was a pleasant afternoon, and David and I went to the detention center to visit Makoto. The dual torment of physical and psychological suffering had drained him. He looked like a lantern on the verge of being extinguished by a storm through the thick bulletproof glass. Makoto glared at me with eyes filled with venom. He gritted his teeth and said, "George, are you here to flaunt your victory?" I let out a soft laugh. I said, "Makoto, do you still think that I consider you my rival? You're just a pawn." I opened my phone and showed him a picture of Willow at the boarding gate wearing a mermaid-style dress. I said, "My people were able to take a picture of Willow boarding a plane. If I wanted to, I could stop her. That day was also my last chance to give her." Makoto, as if struck by something, finally realized. He asked, "Did you leak the news of your marriage to me on purpose? You purposely drew me back to make me the one to ruin everything." He stood up in a fury, pounding the glass with his fists. "Crazy! You crazy bastard! Didn't you love Willow? What the hell do you want?" His emotions were too volatile, and seeing David standing behind me, he began cursing both of us. He shouted, "You two, you two, you two. If it weren't for you provoking me, I wouldn't have wanted to be the best actor. If it weren't for showbiz, there wouldn't have been so many people gathered around. I wouldn't have committed a crime. I wouldn't have ended up here. I wouldn't have had Willow find out I was faking it. My beautiful life has been ruined by both of you. Ruined." I was somewhat helpless. I asked, "Why? After all this, do you still think my target is Willow? My goal has always been Liu family." Makoto was forcibly pushed back into his chair by the prison guards, still shouting, "Why does that concern me? Why do I have to get dragged into this rich people's game?" I stood up and stared him down. I said, "When you shamelessly insisted on living in my wedding room, when you took my signet ring without asking, why didn't you ask yourself the same question? If it's a rich people's game, why are you getting involved?" Makoto broke free from the guards and lunged at the glass. He screamed, "George, wait! I will definitely tell Willow. I will." I took 2 steps back, waved at him with a smile, hung up the phone, and turned to leave. Chapter 16. On the way back, David asked me how I was so sure that Willow and Makoto would fall into the traps I set for them one after another. I thought for a moment and said, "We can never escape our desires. Willow's life has been smooth sailing, and Makoto is the only obstacle in her path. She will be trapped by him. As for Makoto, he's been abroad for over 10 years, never giving up, doing everything he can to contact Willow. As long as you give him hope, he will helplessly cling to Willow like a lifeline." Dragging both of them into the abyss, we both fell silent. We understood that we, too, were part of this game. Chapter 17. With the support of my parents' generation, I smoothly took over Lu Corporation. The affairs of both groups were too complicated. After extensive deliberation and presenting a feasible plan, we obtained the shareholders' approval, and Lu Corporation and Wang Corporation officially merged. Once rival commercial giants, they were now an unshakable behemoth under my control. The company flourished in my hands while Willow lost all her luster. She spent every day in our wedding home, researching the dishes I liked and asking if I would be home for dinner. That so-called home I never went back to. Life went on, indifferent and monotonous, until Makoto was released from prison. The final blow was about to come. Chapter 18. Willow rushed into my office with Makoto. Her eyes were red, looking as if she was about to break down. She stood before me, trembling, trying to reach out and grab me. She choked up and said, "George, tell me, what Makoto said isn't true." Makoto, on the other hand, raised his head proudly, a smug look on his face under Willow's hopeful gaze. I nodded. I said, "What he said is probably true unless he added anything extra." Willow stepped back a couple of steps. Makoto tried to hold her, but she slapped his hand away with a lost look in her eyes. She asked, "George, was it all fake? Those years we spent together when you did everything I liked, those days you stood in front of me and protected me, were they all lies? When you said you would marry me, you seemed so happy. Was everything a lie? I thought you were the only one who truly cared for me. Why are you doing this to me too?" I didn't answer her barrage of questions. Instead, I pulled a file from the cabinet behind me and placed it in front of her. I said, "Willow, I think this file will give you the answer." Chapter 19. Willow trembled as she picked up the file. After seeing its contents, cold sweat began to drip down her face. I gestured for Makoto to help her sit on the sofa, and I made her a cup of coffee, placing it beside her. I said, "Willow, let's speak frankly. Wong Corporation poured all its efforts into securing the Eagle Group's cooperation, but couldn't find any breakthrough. The CEO of Eagle Group is your friend from when you studied in the US. And it was you using Lu Corporation and another one of her deals as leverage who asked her to indefinitely delay any cooperation with Wong Corporation. Your goal was to bring down Wong Corporation. Am I right?" I looked at Makoto, who stood next to me with a confused expression, and smiled. "By the way, I should thank Makoto. You learned about Makoto's illness and couldn't wait to go abroad to see him, even missing our wedding. For that, you had to take out the contract with Eagle Group to appease my father's anger. I know Makoto is your crush, but it was Lou Uncle who tore you apart. Little George, the older brother who always protected you, did nothing wrong, but you threw all your frustration about not being able to fight against Lou Uncle onto me and Wong Corporation. I once cared for you wholeheartedly, but you, every step, were calculating. You don't love me. Why marry me? Because you needed the Wong family support. Now, I guess I fulfilled your dream. Wong and Liu families are united under my control. We're still married, so in a sense you've achieved your dream, right? Am I wrong, Willow?" Willow looked at me with red eyes. She asked, "If you don't love me and know I've been scheming against you, why marry me?" I stared at her in disbelief as if she were a stranger. I replied, "Willow, is this a question you should be asking? Becoming the wife of the Wong family was the greatest help to completing my entire plan." Willow was silent for a long time, long enough that I almost lost my patience. She finally stood up, said nothing, and slowly walked toward the door. She placed her hand on the doorknob, turned around and said slowly, "George, I will take back everything that belongs to me." Chapter 20. In the days that followed, Willow made many efforts, all of which ended in failure. The two corporations had already merged. After 2 years of struggles, she had only a small amount of shares to possibly earn some dividends. With no real influence, repeated refusals had completely worn down Willow's spirit. She had finally become the kind of person she once despised, the rich girl who only knew how to go to bars and party. Chapter 21. For my 25th birthday, Louis and David took the lead and invited the second-generation heirs from our circle for a celebration. I sprawled on the sofa, letting them laugh and make noise around me. Louis couldn't stand it anymore. He brought 10 young models and made me choose one to be with. He grinned and leaned in close, saying, "2 is fine. 3 is fine too." I squinted lazily and scanned the group, randomly pointing at one. I said, "Her, I guess." The young model squatted in front of me, lowering her head shyly, calling me Mr. Wong. Her innocent, youthful appearance and graceful figure leaned against me as she gently massaged my shoulders. I closed my eyes in comfort. Time seemed to stop until Willow's angry voice broke through the moment. She gritted her teeth and said, "George, don't forget I'm still your wife." The young model seemed startled, her hands freezing. I patted her hand, signaling for her to continue. I opened my eyes and met Willow's murderous gaze. Unable to stop myself from laughing, I said, "Willow, I promised to marry you, and I did. You're already my wife. You should be happy, right? But when it comes to feelings, I advise you not to expect too much. You'll never force something that isn't there." Laughter filled the room. I squinted and seemed to see the boy from more than 10 years ago, the one who always followed Willow, frustrated and helpless. He had finally stopped, turning toward me with a smile.